I can see how it feels kind of impossible to even begin to create something like the houses you might see in Laika. And you're probably right. If you're drawing houses like this, the step from here to here is quite a big one. But I think a big part of the problem is that it can seem as if designs like this just happen, but they don't. So we're going to start from this bad house and create something kind of passable. It's perhaps not as fancy as the architecture you might see in games like Candle, but I think it's important to understand that most artists don't magically create something fancy. They often start with something simple. Now what I want you to do is just take a look at this house and try and just think about why this is bad. And don't just focus on small things like the colors or that it looks flat. Even though adding perspective might be a small improvement, it isn't going to fix this house. The biggest problem with this house is that it looks like an icon. This is our house, and this is a home button. As an artist, we're designing a world, a place where our characters exist. And so it is our job to go from the general concept of a house and create a particular house that fits the environment of our game. This doesn't mean that our house needs to be fancy, but if you look at a game like Celeste, this is simple, but it isn't a house icon. It's a simple log cabin, just like one you might find on a mountain. So the first thing we should do is make the shape more interesting. And well, the shape would be more interesting if we just had something here on the side. So if we just imagine that we want to create a red cottage in the woods, what could we add on this side of the house that would fit that type of world? Well, we don't even have to stretch our imagination. We can just look at a game like Stardew Valley. We need a place to store our logs. So we add a small little addition to our house with a slanted roof. This is better, but now our other side feels a bit empty and dull. Once again, now we want something here. Now we just need to think of something that fits. And we frankly don't need to be imaginative. Maybe a house like this needs a tool shed, so we add a tool shed. But now we might start running into some issues. Okay, we added a tool shed, but now our tool shed also looks boring and like an icon. But this is also a situation where we can use the exact same process. So even though our first instinct might be to start with this, we can take a look at a small section of this toolshed, like the roof, and make the roof more interesting. So instead of a slanted roof, maybe we have an arched roof. This is slightly better, but perhaps still a bit boring, given that we only have this empty red wall here. So what can we do to make this wall more interesting? Well, here we also need to think of the story we want to tell with our house. I think a nice idea for this type of house is to make it sort of dilapidated. So I'm just going to run with this idea for every single thing I want to add. I'm gonna make everything sort of dilapidated. So I always go step by step. I think about adding a thing, and then I think about what that thing needs to be in order to tell my story. Conceivably, you could add something else. It all depends on what you want your architecture to communicate. Everything you add is an opportunity to sell a story. Take that opportunity. In this case, we went for dilapidated, so now we have this. What is our problem now? Is it the colors? Nope. Once again, we go for the biggest problem. Our biggest problem right now is that the toolshed looks like a separate entity from our house. And we want the toolshed to be sort of a part of our house design. So we need to connect them. And we just look for a type of connection that would kind of make sense. Now the overall shape, the silhouette of our house, looks slightly more interesting. But even though our toolshed is dilapidated, our main building shape is still very tidy and very much still like a general idea of a house. It's not a particularly worn down old red cottage. So let's just mess it up a bit and just break this wall. And then we do the same thing to the window. Everything we add is an opportunity to sell a story. So we use it to tell that story. This round window up here looks perfect and artificial. What if the poor dude that lived in this house was the one who fixed that window? How would he fix it? Well, maybe by just nailing some scrap wood to it. Every step of the way, we try to think of not just that we dislike what we have, but why we dislike what we have. And so instead of thinking, I don't like this window, I try to think of why I don't like this window. Well, now that we had these big planks on the window, now our roof planks look too thin, so we make them thicker. Now we might think that this section looks to be too high up or too empty. What should we do? Well, we think of something we could conceivably add that fits our message. Perhaps a ventilation grate would work, and maybe he fixed a hole in the wall. I think it's important to note here that just because I add these things doesn't mean that adding these particular things is the best choice. Instead of adding the ventilation grate, I could have just lowered the top half of the house. That might have worked just as well. If you want to learn how to create your own unique thing, you need to be able to sit with the terrible art you have and work on it step by step until it's slightly less terrible. But once again, we don't magically end up with something great. We just move from something terrible to something less terrible. And we need to be happy with that. So how can we make this less terrible? Well, now our shape and our house is at least interesting. So now we maybe brighten up the colors a bit. And perhaps we could see if we like the house more if we tidy up our line art. And yes, it's a bit better. Now I personally thought the colors here were really terrible and boring, so I just picked up a noise brush and went wild. And then I went wild again. And then I cleaned up the stuff I ruined, and now we have something decent. This type of color process is something beyond the scope of this video. I talked a bit about it in my recent Patreon video, but at its core, even though this version is more polished than what you might be able to create, I think it's important to note that if you can create this, you can also kind of create this. So obviously we could plop this into a scene, and it will kind of work. This is probably the thumbnail for this video. But I want to go back to these houses in Laika. They're actually fairly complex, but I think the process that they've gone through here tends to be kind of what most artists tend to do. If we look at these houses in Tales of Iron, we can kind of imagine them going through the same process. The house here almost still has that kind of home icon shape, but we can kind of imagine them thinking that the bottom of the house needs to be more interesting in a way that a medieval house might look. So they added a rock foundation. And then they maybe wanted to throw in an arc here in order to make this space less empty. And then for the top section of the house, well, they want to break it up and separate and make it a bit different, so they add some wood paneling. But then they also wanted something on top of that, and they just added some Bavarian architectural detail, and now they have a fancy house. So even though they maybe started out simple, they probably went step by step until they sort of had something nicer, just like we did. And depending on the house you create, you might want to keep it somewhat simple. These houses in Wonder Boy are still kind of simple. Architecturally, they even kind of look the same. But we can also see that the artist has stopped and thought, hey, this is an armory. Let's make our windows wooden and square, kind of blocky. But then also thought, maybe we should make our church window arched with crosses in them to make them look more religious. So even though the houses look both simple and similar, they tell a different story with just a couple of things. If we look at this house in Iconoclast, we can almost imagine them starting out with a similar shape to what we had, but then sort of adding pillars, then adding windows, then making the windows cool with stained glass, then adding this arch to the middle, and ending it by sprinkling some vines on top, layer by layer building complexity. If you can imagine this process, you can kind of start replicating this process. And just because we in this particular case went for a very basic house shape, the same process is kind of what we might follow for a more complex shape. Just because the shape is different, it doesn't mean that the process is different. And look, for some designs like the houses in SteamWorld Dig, or the houses in Laika, yes, the initial starting concept for these houses are probably quite complex from the start, but you don't need to be that grandiose with your vision in order to create something decent. A house like this in Rogue Legacy, which looks really awesome, has a really complex solution to how to make the house more fancy, with a sort of 3D looking roof arc and these fancy shingles. But the base for this house is actually really similar to what we made here. And I probably wouldn't be able to add these type of nice details, but you have to work with what you got. If we look at Gumbrella, it feels as if they went all out in this direction. Look at the shape of this house. It's just a box shape. Granted, these roof tiles are kind of fancy, but the rest of what makes this building cool is just that it's peppered with character. It's peppered with stuff that tells a story. I made a quick Patreon video where I discussed the color process I made for this house. Feel free to support me there, it really helps. Thanks for watching. Bye.